This solitary divine worship is at the same time essentially the divine worship of a community, and the pure inner knowing and perceiving of itself advances to the moment of consciousness. The contemplation of itself is its objective existence, and this objective element is the declaration of its knowing and willing as something universal. Through this declaration, the self acquires moral validity, and the act becomes an effective deed. The actuality and lasting existence of what it does is universal self-consciousness. But the declaration of conscience affirms the certainty of itself to be pure self, and thereby to be a universal self. On account of this utterance in which the self is expressed and acknowledged as essential being, the validity of the act is acknowledged by others. The spirit and substance of their association are thus the mutual assurance of their conscientiousness, good intentions, the rejoicing over this mutual purity, and the refreshing of themselves in the glory of knowing and uttering, of cherishing and fostering such an excellent state of affairs. Insofar as this conscience still distinguishes its abstract consciousness from its self-consciousness, it has only a hidden life in God. It is true that God is immediately present in its mind and heart in itself, but what is manifest, its actual consciousness, and the mediating movement of that consciousness is for it something other than that hidden inner life and the immediacy of God's presence. It is only in the completed form of conscience that the distinction between its abstract consciousness and its self-consciousness is eliminated. Conscience knows that the abstract consciousness is just this self, this being for itself that is certain of itself, knows that it is precisely in the immediacy of the relation of the self to the in itself, which, when posited outside the self, is an abstract God and hidden from it, that the difference is eliminated. For that relation is a mediating one in which the related terms are not one and the same, but each is an other for the other, and only in a third term are they one. The immediate relation, however, means in fact nothing else but the unity of the terms. The consciousness that has risen above the thoughtlessness that still holds these differences, which are none to be differences, knows the immediacy of the presence within itself of the absolute being as the unity of that being and its own self. It thus knows itself as the living in itself, and knows that this knowledge is religion, which as knowledge that has a perceived or outer existence is the utterance of the community concerning its own spirit. Paragraph 656 is one of these longish paragraphs in which there's a lot going on, and you could say that the feeling, the affectivity inhabiting it is somewhat of a triumphal nature. We're going to see consciousness congratulating itself, not just by itself, but as an entire community over all these wonderful things that it has attained at this point in its development. Now, whenever you see something like this happening for Hegel, you should always be, at this point in the phenomenology, a little bit skeptical about the presentation. Not skeptical necessarily about whether Hegel's getting things right, but about whether this actually represents what Hegel thinks is happening, and whether the self-portrayal by consciousness, self-consciousness, spirit at this point in time is in fact true, or whether it's, in some respect, deceiving itself, lying to itself. And that is definitely the case here. So for those who would read this out of context and say, oh, this is so wonderful, solitary divine worship of a community, jumping further down, we've achieved the absolute being as the unity of that being in its own self. This is so amazing, so wonderful. We've got God immediately present in mind. None of that is actually what Hegel thinks at bottom is really going on. He is presenting this, as he has in the previous paragraphs, and with so many other dialectics, to allow a shape of consciousness to present itself, its own self-portrayal in its fullness, so that afterwards he can say, well, there's more to the story than this, and we can see that there are oppositions and antitheses coming out of this that undermine it, that show it to be hollow. We're veering eventually towards the religion section. Hegel mentions religion here. And we're also veering towards the end of this morality section, in which he's going to accuse this sort of consciousness that we find in conscience of being a mere beautiful soul, being, as we sometimes say here, all talk and no do. And talking or expression, as we saw in the previous paragraphs, is an absolutely essential element of what's going on here. So, all that said by way of preface, so that people don't think that Hegel is actually, setting this out as sort of an endpoint. It's sort of a glorious achievement for consciousness, self-consciousness, spirit, but it's also one that rings hollow, rings false. Let's take a look at the actual text and at what's going on. So it starts out pretty good. This solitary divine worship, which solitary divine worship? The one that was just talked about in paragraph 655, where the conscience is its own self-divine worship. Its action is the contemplation of its own divinity, saying that it is essentially God or God-like. Right? The voice of conscience in me as I take my stand. That is the voice of God. And how many people have been deluded by their own voices within? Well, conscience doesn't worry about this at this point. It is convinced that it is right. And it's going to be even more than that. So he goes, this is at the same time essentially the divine worship of something more. What's more than the individual? You could say society. Hegel doesn't use that term here. Instead, he brings up a community, a Gemeinde. There's a contrast in German between a community, sort of like a local, or what Hegel has earlier called an ethical community, and then society, Gesellschaft, where things are more regulated according to norms that are above the board rather than being regulated by customs or habits, Sitte, and structures that have been replicated over and over again. And so we should see this as involving what Hegel in earlier parts was calling ethical substance in sections of the Phenomenology found in the reason portion of the work and earlier in the spirit portion of the work. This is an attempt to sort of recuperate this and bring it back in. It's also, I think you should say, there's a lot of different translations for this in the Phenomenology. Hegel will talk about the Sache selbst, something that if you go back to particularly the reason section, you're going to see him bringing up a lot in terms of moral or ethical comportments, right? So in the sections like reason and the law of the heart, or, the section on virtue, or reason giving itself laws, what is it trying to do? It's trying to, we can literally translate Sache selbst as the thing itself, but it really means something like the, ethical project, the main show. So there's this back and forth between conscience, the conscience of the person, and an entire community. And now this is not just with one individual, although each individual is portraying themselves this way. There's multiple people, and they comprise this community, and they do it through this divine worship. I do want to say a little bit about this term divine worship. So, Gottesdienst, in German, yes, it can be translated as divine worship. I think in this section, you could also talk about it as the divine service. And you could say worship, service, aren't they the same thing? Yes, although Dienst, dienen, this goes all the way back to the master-slave dialectic and to the unhappy consciousness, right? Where there's this split between the individual consciousness and God, the divine. And one of the tragic things in the unhappy consciousness is that the individual who devalues him or herself in relation to the divine, the eternal, does not realize that they are actually projecting that it comes from them and from their community. And they lose sight of that in trying to worship this divine other. Here, the divine worship is of the conscience and of the community. And you could say, well, who's doing the worshiping? Who's doing the serving? Well, they're both worshiping and serving, and being worshipped and being served. And so he says, the pure inner knowing and perceiving of itself advances to the moment of consciousness, Bewusstsein, he says. And there's no qualifier there. It's not self-consciousness. It's just consciousness. So being aware of, and then he says, the contemplation of itself is its objective existence, and this objective element is the declaration of its knowing and willing as something universal. That's not something really that new. He's been saying that throughout the thing. Conscience asserts itself, its own point of view, as the one that reflects a universal knowing and willing. Now, is that really the case? Well, that'll have to be seen. He goes on and he says, through this declaration, now declaration here is aussprechen, right? Literally sort of like saying out, saying onto, right? So there's an element of the language there. It's not just that the actions are expressive. It's not just that we can peer inside people's heads and see their knowing and willing. It is something that is being said. My conscience, this is what I am doing. I do the act, and then I also talk about it for the people in my community, and they do the same thing, and we're all one big, happy, acting family, you could say, or local community. So he says, through this declaration, the self acquires moral validity. Okay, that's interesting. So without talking about itself, this implies that it can't really have complete moral validity. It can't be entirely certain of itself as a moral being without talking about it. There's another thing he says right here as well that's really interesting. The act becomes an effective deed. Here are the terms that he's using. Handlung, act, really should be translated action, becomes an effective deed, tat. You could translate it as the action or the praxis becomes an effective act. It is consolidated into an act, can be identified as such. And then he goes and says the actuality and lasting existence of what it does is universal. Now notice self-consciousness, universal self-consciousness. But the declaration of conscience affirms the certainty of itself to be pure self and thereby to be a universal self. And this seems like it's, once again replicating this dialectic and even distinction, Unterschied, right, between the abstract universal self and actual existing particular self-consciousness, the person that I am. When I affirm myself as acting rightly because of conscience, I am saying that I am in some way also this universal self. But that's, kind of tough to pull off, because what if you do it too? What if the other members of my community say, no, you're acting the wrong way. My conscience tells me something different. So there is this distinction between this abstract universal self and the self that I am. But it's being overcome here, he says, on account of this utterance in which the self is expressed, now notice, and acknowledged as essential being. The validity of the act is acknowledged by others in my community, other consciences, other self-consciousnesses who are the other to me, and I am the other to them. We're getting recognized, we're getting en erkant, acknowledged, recognized. We're getting what it is that consciousness and self-consciousness have been looking for this entire time, since the struggle, the moment of recognition involved in the struggle to the death, a totally imperfect one, and then the master-slave dialectic, then the various dialectics of self-consciousness, then all the things that happen in reason and in spirit up till this point. It looks like we're finally getting what we truly want. A mutual self-recognition that's consolidated in a way of life, in a living community. So he goes on and he says, here's where it gets really interesting. The spirit and substance of their association are thus the mutual assurance of all these different things. Now, we're gonna talk about that in a moment, but first I want to come back to this. So in this interaction between conscience and the community through this divine worship of each other, of themselves, and all of that, all these great reconciliations, we have a sort of focus on these four elements: knowing, willing, acting, and expressing. Aussprechen, he also uses the term rede, which can be translated in a number of different ways. Discourse is a good way to talk about it. So language is playing a central role here. And in addition to having recognition, now we actually also have what he's translating Miller here as mutual assurance. I think it's gegenseitige Versicherung, right? A being secure in something. So it's not just that I get recognition from you, and you get recognition from me, and that's wonderful already. We also get assurances or security from each other in this. You're a person of conscience. I'm a person of conscience. We're in this wonderful community. We're all so great together. We would never steal from each other or slander each other or privilege our own over yours or cheat or do any of those sorts of things. We're all these wonderful people together. Isn't this marvelous? And now we can go on and talk about again, this is quite important, the spirit and substance, right? It's rare that we have these things actually united in one thing, right? The spirit and substance of their association is what? The mutual assurance, the being able to count on a bunch of different things. Conscientiousness, Gewissenhaftigkeit is the word here. Conscience, right? It's not just conscience. Each of us has a conscience. We've all got conscientiousness. We're following our consciences, right? Good intentions, guten Absichten, right? We can rely on everybody else as having the right motivational structure, the right prioritization of goods, the right capacity to choose, good over evil over and over again, right? All these things. And intentions are, we should point out, it's just been talked about in the previous paragraphs, intentions are inside of ourselves. How do we know that other people's intentions are good? We're relying on them actually being expressed. I say, I would never do anything wrong. I am only thinking of the common good or what's best, or you, my dear friend, right? And they're saying similar things as well. Mutual purity. Here he talks about rejoicing over mutual purity, right? Wechselseitige Reinheit. Reinheit is, the state of being pure. Wechselseitige, there's an exchange. The purity reinforces each other's purity. And then here he says something really interesting as he brings this to a close. The refreshing of themselves in the glory. The glory here is translating Herrlichkeit. And, okay, that makes sense to translate it as glory. Not only does Miller do that, but others do as well. Glory is what the Lord has. Herr is Lord, so it could be understood in terms of the divine, the Gott, right, the God. But it can also be understood. Herr is also the master. The master in the master-slave dialectic, and all the things that go after the master-slave dialectic into the other movements of self-consciousness. There's this struggle with both the human lord or master and also the absolute master, death. So Herrlichkeit I'm not saying don't translate it as glory. I'm just saying there's more of a resonance there that should, if you're paying attention, ooh, there's something else being signified here. Now, let's come back to it. In the glory of what? The glory of knowing and uttering, expressing, talking. And now he says something else. Instead of saying willing and acting, he brings up two other things. Things that we could say, well, they are in some respect acts, and they are in some respect willing as well, provided we understand will in a rather broad sense, where it doesn't just comprise deliberate choices made at a particular point in time between two options, but rather includes our sort of general inclinations and the structures of our willing, our heart, you could say. So we look at it in a, you might say, more Augustinian kind of sense. So what else do we have here? We have knowing and uttering, cherishing and fostering. Cherishing. Isn't that an interesting thing to talk about? Loving. And also fostering, which is an action thing as well. This wonderful state of affairs. This great interaction between the community, fully realized people, all of this, isn't this amazing? So that's what is being portrayed as what's been achieved. Now there's another way he's talking about this as well. He says, insofar as this conscience still distinguishes, makes an Unterschied, right, separates out these two things. Its abstract consciousness from its self-consciousness. It has only a hidden life in God. Its true God is immediately present in its mind and heart, in itself, but what is manifest, its actual consciousness and the mediating movement of that consciousness, is for it something other than that hidden inner life and the immediacy of God's presence. And the question is, can it bring this then to light? Can it overcome this? And here Hegel is saying conscience thinks that it has done that. It succeeded in that. He says it's only in the completed form of consciousness, the one that has been brought to its fruition, the one that has completely been worked through, which, conscience is portraying itself to itself and to all the other members of the community as consciences, as having now done this. Whether or not that's a true claim is yet to be seen. As it turns out, it's going to be false. But it has in some respect, I should take that back, it has brought itself to its fulfillment, to its completion. It's just that its completion isn't what it takes it to be, right? This is as good as it's going to get for a conscience, and it's not going to be as good as it needs it to be to bring the process to an end. So he says the completed form of conscience, the distinction between its abstract consciousness, this abstract universal self, and its self-consciousness winds up being, and here Miller translated it as eliminated. You could say eliminated. It's Aufheben, right? So we could also say sublated, transformed into something else. Because it's not as if it's totally just effaced and left behind entirely. So he says, conscience knows that the abstract consciousness is just this self. This being for itself that is certain of itself knows that it is precisely in the immediacy of the relation of the self to the in itself, which, when posited outside of the self, is an abstract God and hidden from it. That's the unhappy consciousness again. Or whatever else we're making the divine and saying, that's not us, that's something else, that's where the most important stuff is. No, here conscience says, I am actually, as who I am, this individual, I am also the locus of divinity in the universe, as is everybody else in the community that we're all sharing this wonderful experience with. But coming back to the single person who's talking about this, he says that the relation is a mediating one, in which the related terms are not one and the same, but each is an other for the other. Only in a third term are they one. The immediate relation means, in fact, nothing else but the unity of these terms. So what's happening here? Consciousness is making consciousness as conscience is making itself something where there's an immediate unity and a distinction is being effaced. A distinction is no longer being respected, but rather there's a I am this going on in it. And he says, the consciousness that has risen above the thoughtlessness that still holds these differences, which are none to be differences, knows the immediacy of the presence within itself of, now here's where Miller adds something in, the absolute being as the unity of that being in its own self. The German doesn't actually have the absolute being. He's reading that in, and I don't think that's really a problem, provided we realize that this is consciousness, in effect, deceiving itself as conscience, telling itself that it's achieved much more than it has. So it's telling itself that it is the unity of being, Wesen, and its own self, and it is the living in itself, and knows, then he says, that this knowledge is religion, which is knowledge that is a perceived or outer existence, is the utterance of the community concerning its own spirit. So there's a lot of the individual now speaking on the part of the community, using the community as sort of an amplifier to say, I am this, this is what is going on. I cannot be mistaken in the moral stances that I take because my knowing, my willing, my action, and my talking about it are not just pure or without sin, or however you want to put it, right? They are the abstract self and the individual self unified now, and I'm speaking for God. So when we put it like that, I think you might start to see some of the points where an outside observer, like Hegel, like a phenomenologist, could say, oh, is that really the case? They might bring together to bear a kind of Socratic irony and say, really? You think so? That's amazing. Tell me more about this. And, the Socratic dialectic of tell me more about this, you know how that works if you've read Plato's dialogues. There's always some presentation of something, and bringing it into the light allows you to see where the cracks are, where the flaws are, to go around to the backside and say, wait a second, looks good from this side, but this is all garbage here. And that is exactly where we're going to be going with this. So this whole thing, this whole wonderful moment, or as Miller has it translated here, the sort of mutual congratulation on this excellent state of affairs, it is something that has been attained, at least in part. It's gone out there as an ideal for us, but it's not actually going to be realized at this point, despite conscience asserting that it is.